Right on the Nail with Chris Wright.
Hi, I'm Chris Wright and welcome to Right on the Nail. This week we have our special guest episode where I have the pleasure of speaking to a very special guest, Bill Roedy. Bill's the former chairman and chief executive of MTV Networks International. Bill and his team built a global operation from scratch, comprising 200 channels and 20 brands in 200 countries all over the world, reaching a potential audience of 2 billion people. Prior to joining MTV, he spent 10 years at HBO as their vice president, where he was inducted as one of the pioneers of the US cable industry. But before this, he was part of the United States Army, a veteran of the Vietnam War, and commander of 3 missile bases during the Cold War. He has gained huge recognition throughout the world, with awards including an Emmy Founders Award and the Leadership Business Award presented to Bill by former President Bill Clinton, and that's just to name a few. As Global Health Ambassador, Bill is involved with many charities, including UNAIDS, the Global Media AIDS Initiative Leadership Committee, and the Global Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunizations. Bill is an amazing person. It's great to have you with us today.
Right on the Nail with Chris Wright.
The bulk of your career has been in the creative industry, where you forged such a deep reputation for yourself and achieved so many things, yet you started out as a soldier. It's very rare to find a soldier and a creative person merged into the same being. Now, why did you start off life as a soldier? Why did you even go to West Point?
Well, that's a good question, Chris. Thank you for all that. The real reason, however, is that I couldn't afford other colleges. I came from a very modest background, single mom. My father, however, also went to West Point. So that was part of the link. It was back in the days when West Point was very prestigious and before the Vietnam War. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I grew up in Miami. I was literally on the beach on the weekends surfing. And then I found myself in July of 1966 at West Point with a rifle and a bayonet saying kill in practice. So it was a dramatic change of life for me.
How did you handle that? Because that was so different.
It was so different. I didn't handle it very well. I wasn't a particularly good cadet. By the way, there's a recent irony. I've been given this distinguished graduate designation, the only one in my class. And I'm not exaggerating by saying I was probably the worst cadet in my class. And I just survived, really, more than anything else. Just survived.
But your father was he was a decorated war hero.
He was in Pearl Harbor, and my sister was born right after the attack, by the way. And then he went on for a 35-year career, Vietnam, Korea. But I think most noteworthy, he was, right there in the Pacific during Pearl Harbor. He was in Pearl Harbor. In fact, he was responsible for the observatory sites around the islands. So sometimes in humor, I say, my father had a lot to do with starting World War II.
Well, he did, didn't he, if that was the case. But if you weren't a natural West Point person, then when you finished there, why did you then sign up to go into the Army? Did you have to, or could you have said, hey, this isn't the life for me?
No, you have to. It's very expensive education. So obviously, because the government pays for it, you have to pay them back. So I had a 5-year commitment, which at the time, when you're 18, seems like forever. But I think the bigger irony in your question, perhaps, is I then volunteered to go to Vietnam when it wasn't necessarily popular to go to Vietnam. And one of the reasons is because I felt like the government gave me so much with this free education that I had to step up and, answer the call to duty and go to the direction of as they say, the sound of the cannons.
Because most people were trying to get out of going to Vietnam, yet you signed up to go there.
That's true. I did. Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Or did you regret it when you got to Vietnam? Did you suddenly think, what am I doing here?
Well, there's lots of stories about my experiences in Vietnam, but no, I have to say I don't regret it. I grew an awful lot. I had leadership opportunities. I was thrown into the fire pretty quickly. went to a fire base that ironically was the same name as my wife at the time, Firebase Nancy, which had a successful chemical attack. So it all happened, really, really quickly. But I fell in love with the country. I fell in love with the people. I've been back many, many times since then. And so in the end, while it was war, of course, for me, it was I won't say a positive experience, because war never can be a positive experience, but I certainly learned a lot.
I mean, one of the things about Vietnam is that it was such a huge issue at the time, especially within the music industry, the music world, the creative world. The opposition to Vietnam, which I'm sure you were aware about, was taking place back home, especially in the States, was really a catalyst for some of the great music that came out of that era. So were you aware that when you were in Vietnam doing what you were doing for your country, that back home there was all this resentment and all of these creative people that were really like joined together and combined in their opposition to it?
Well, you could not be aware of it, of course. And even at West Point, before I went to Vietnam, there was a bit of a juxtaposition, because West Point's 50 miles north of the city, and we were always delivered the New York Times every day. So we were very aware of the opinions against the war and the demonstrations, yet we were getting a completely opposite point of view, obviously, from the school and from our leaders at West Point. So there was a conflict there. And I think it confused a lot of people. And maybe the subtext of my volunteering for Vietnam was finding out really what the answer was, which was a naive thought, because once you get into combat, there's no room for thinking strategically about geopolitical issues, whether it's right or wrong. It's more just about getting on with the mission. So it was a bit of a naive thought, but you're absolutely right. There was a lot of it was a paradox. There's no question.
Yeah, and Woodstock wouldn't have been too far away from West Point as well.
Yeah, the irony about the music, because later in my life I had this whole career around music, is that was a bit of a gap for me, because you're so busy at West Point. And you're right, Woodstock was, I was in Camp Buckner at the time, which is literally 45 minutes away. I kind of missed that whole era. And I know that was one of your unbelievable experiences, being a music leader, that you were experiencing all that amazing music. So, to end up at MTV was really unusual, because I didn't know that much about music certainly during the 60s and even the 70s.
Yeah, I know. When you first came over, it was people saying, "Hey, what?" They were trying to struggle to put the two together. But then it wasn't just Vietnam. After Vietnam, you were actually in control of nuclear bombs. Was it your finger actually on the button? And could you have actually pushed that button, or does that require somebody other than you to make that bomb actually go off?
Yeah, no, it most definitely requires. It's called two-man control. And in this case, it was missiles, Nike Hercules missiles, which ironically my father worked on when he was in the Army. You have to go through, I had a security clearance, top secret, autumnal, which was the war plans for NATO, and cryptographic. The cryptographic refers to the codes. So you cannot release the nuclear weapons unless you have two people confirm the control. The other interesting thing about the nuclear weapons is it goes straight to the president. There is no chain of command in between. So once the president gives the release order, he carries the box that's affectionately called the football, then you have direct access to release the nuclear weapons. But again, it's two-man control.
So was it just you and the president then on these missiles?
That's one way of putting it, I guess. But
I'll take that as a yes then.
Hypothetically, I would say hypothetically. And the nuclear weapons, it's kind of a scary thing to say. I hid all this, by the way, while I was with MTV all those years, because it's not necessarily the most popular thing to say that you controlled nuclear weapons. Each one was twice the size of Hiroshima. And it was originally used, the missiles, to shoot down airplanes, squadrons of airplanes coming over. I was in Italy at the time, part of NATO, and I had 3 bases. Each one had 16 missiles. And so you can see the overkill of the nuclear proliferation at that time, that we actually used nuclear weapons to fire down squadrons of airplanes. Eventually, I'll just say one more thing, it was shifted to, while I was there, from a surface to air to surface to surface.
And then at some point in your life, you just decided to completely jump ship. Well, I suppose Harvard came first, but then after Harvard, you went into, a very trendy at the time niche area of the entertainment business with HBO, which was, that was like the new frontier at the time. This is the weird thing. I mean, how could you go from nuclear missiles to HBO?
It is a bit unusual. I will say that. People would always ask me what's in common between the two, and I would say absolutely nothing is in common. I found common dots, though, as I went on, with the organization of MTV. I made it like a military organization with small companies around the world. I tried to use some of the leadership traits, like, for example, first on the battlefield. When you manage a global operation, there's always a problem somewhere in the world. So you have to go there and solve the problem. So I adopted the first on the battlefield, the last to leave. And then the other one I did from the military was very quick to take blame, slow to take credit. But no, it's very unusual, I must say. Yes, you're absolutely right.
And did all your people at HBO and then MTV realize that some of these maxims that you were working on were military ones, that you were importing from the military to a creative business?
No, not at all. Not at all.
No.
As I was saying earlier, I really kind of hid the whole military background thing because I didn't think it worked with rock and roll. And so people really didn't know too much about that part of my background until much later, when I would reveal it to some of the artists, and to my surprise, they actually warmed up to it. I'm thinking about Bono or Wycliffe. Father was in the military. But for the most part, I didn't talk too much about it.
So then with MTV, I mean, it was such a huge success, not just as a business, not just because you took it into all of these different countries, places that had never seen anything like that before, and because it became such an important part of youth culture and everything else. But the impact it had through doing that was immense. I mean, literally, your role and the role of MTV and the role of Bill Roedy personally in bringing down the Berlin Wall, it's been documented. How much do you think you personally were involved in bringing down the Berlin Wall?
Oh, there's no question. I did it all myself. There's no question. Well, let me respond to your earlier point first. MTV did become a phenomenon. There's no question. I mean, it's not that now, but as I did sort of a patent thing in distribution around the world, and I had a very simple strategy, which at the time seemed, everything was more complex back then, but the strategy was very simple. Wanted to be in every household in the world, distribution, and I coined a phrase, aggressive, creative, relentless distribution. Number two, and this was a radically different from any other business, I wanted to have a product that matched the local populace, respect and reflect local culture. And then the third leg to the stool was do something good. And, whether it was voting or unemployment or don't drink, don't take drugs, the big one was HIV/AIDS. So we became the sole multimedia vehicle really to help fight that pandemic. But it was, I must say, it was, to your point, a real trip for the entire time, because we were just riding from high to high. When I left, which was 9 years ago, 8 out of every 10 viewers were outside the US.
Yeah, it's amazing what you achieved. But one of the things was that people behind the Iron Curtain that would have been banned from seeing all of this, I mean, they were banned from seeing what life was really like. They might be in East Berlin and see the bright lights, but they're still told that their world in Eastern Europe was the real world, and the rest of the capitalist world was collapsing and everything was going wrong. And then they could get MTV because it was not encrypted or blocked or anything like that. And they could see that this was bullshit. And that must have been a huge factor in developing the movement of people thinking, well, we're being lied to. We want something else. We want to see what life is like outside. And MTV was a huge part of that.
Well, you said it perfectly, Chris. As you know, I have a section, a 3.5-ton section of the Berlin Wall in our courtyard that I bought in support of Gorbachev at our 2009 celebration of the 20th anniversary. By the way, I developed this relationship with Gorbachev, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, how did you get on with Gorbachev? That was going to be my next question.
Very well. He called me Missile Man. He actually said, and it's engraved on the section of the wall that we have here, that missiles were not nearly as powerful as music. And, music unites us and missiles obviously divide us. But, let me just spend a couple, 30 seconds on the Berlin Wall, because it really is an amazing story. So my first decision, what was it, January of 1989, was to go on a brand new satellite that Murdoch had just purchased. It was called, he didn't purchase it, but he purchased a row of transponders. And that's how he launched Sky. The satellite was called Astra. Ironically, HBO was thinking about international distribution, but didn't pursue it. So Astra was controlled by a Luxembourg company. So to the chagrin of all my colleagues in New York, I decided to buy a transponder on that satellite. And what that transponder enabled us to do was broadcast throughout Europe with a 60-centimeter dish. Before, you needed a 3.5-meter dish. And the reason I did that is because there wasn't a lot of cable like there was in the US. So because you could therefore get it with a 60-centimeter dish, to your point, people were buying dishes even behind the Iron Curtain. Some had relatives in New York from Poland, and they would get $1,000 just to buy a dish to get a glimpse of the other side of the Iron Curtain. So it was quite extraordinary, because we at one point had more distribution behind the Iron Curtain than we did, on the Western side. So this became, sort of a mantra with us, tied in because of my background with the Army and NATO and missiles, of course. While it was questioned in New York why I was so adamant about distribution behind the Iron Curtain, to me, it was a bit about, the future, of course, of the business, but it was this chance to make a cultural difference. And sure enough, the country started dropping, as you know, in 89, early 89, culminating on November 9th. I was in Berlin. I happened to be in Berlin. I was there to deliver a speech on East meets West. And part of the condition of me being there was hooking up MTV throughout East Berlin. And as soon as we flipped the switch, it was on a Tuesday, I'll never forget it. I went to a reception with a Politburo, and no one showed up, and I found out that they resigned. So I immediately made the connection. They resigned because MTV was hooked up. So then the journalists on this thing about music being more powerful than missiles. So the legend kind of grew. The real story is Gorbachev, commander of the Warsaw troops, ordered the soldiers not to fire. It was a string of events going, everything from the Pope going to Poland, Hungary, lowering their borders, to the blunder by the bureaucrat. And that's really the reason the wall fell. However, I will say this, somewhat like Arab Spring, there was a small role played by technology, the Arab Spring, Twitter and Facebook. In this case, there was MTV distribution behind the Iron Curtain. To this day, I don't think it was, I think it was less about the music than it was about the commercials. And, as you rightly say, people saw what it was like on the other side. But I never took it seriously. I just told the story with tongue in cheek, and it took off, and I gave out sections of the wall to everybody, and we became this company that was known for breaking down barriers.
Was Gorbachev just a man for his time then? If he wasn't there, would the world be a different place now?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Chris. He was in the right, sort of like Churchill, World War II. No, he was a man of the moment. He did the right thing. As you know, ironically, he was not so popular as the person inside Russia breaking up the Soviet Union, but he's a hero for the rest of the world.
Speaking of men for their times, what about Mandela? How close were you to Mandela, and what was your view of him?
Well, we got lucky on that one. I mean, we because of the third pillar in our strategy of doing good is good for business, we were heavily involved in the AIDS epidemic. Mandela was too. He lost his son to AIDS. So that grew over time, but we ended up doing a lot of shows about Mandela. He actually launched our Africa service. I spent a week with him at his former home. It's now the Hotel Saxon, if you've ever been to Johannesburg, small little boutique hotel. He spent time there right when he was released from prison. So yeah, we spent a lot of time with him. We did documentaries. It was more or less luck. I would find myself in a private room with him sometimes, talking about, how he overcame apartheid, what it was like to be in the prison. So that turned out to be a really rewarding experience, no question.
And how much do you think it's people and how much do you think it's events? And I mean, we're talking about two people that caused huge things to develop in the world, huge changes. We've talked about Churchill as well. I mean, how much is the world and life about people and how much is it about events which go beyond what people can control?
I think it is a lot about people, but it's people have to be given the opportunity. And if you have the opportunity to make a difference in all three examples that you just gave, and probably the biggest one was Churchill during World War II, then you seize that opportunity and wow, what a difference in the world all three of those people you just mentioned have made.
And so what was it that started you off with the huge campaign and everything that you've done for World AIDS? Was that directly as a result of Africa and Mandela, or was that just an initiative that you came up by yourself?
It was a slow burn. When I worked in LA, LA was hit very hard, so I knew people that died of AIDS. When I went to MTV, one of the great things that I realized, I always had a dream when I was a kid to work for television. I grew up in a broken household that would gather around a TV set on Sunday nights, and I realized the power of television. So I always wanted to work for, something to do with this great invention of television. And then when I got to MTV, I realized, wow, this thing could actually make a difference. Yes, it was to lift the spirit, but again, on my three parts of the strategy, part number 3 was do things that could make a difference. And when I decided to, in addition to all the issues that we were covering around the world, to do one big issue for all of MTV, we researched it. And lo and behold, for our audience, 18, 25, AIDS became the number one issue. This is, back in the 90s when it was just completely out of control. So we jumped on it. That I did have a personal involvement, as I mentioned, but when we researched it, it also became an issue that was very important to our audience and therefore to our business. So that's what started. I put my secretary in charge of it, Georgia Arnold. She's now the guru for all of Viacom for social media. So back in the early days, the concept of CSR, corporate social responsibility, was really being, in a way, defined by this. And it's hard to measure the impact. Behavioral change was a big part of it. It's very hard to measure that. But honestly, I think we did make a difference and still do. It's the largest multimedia campaign against the pandemic before COVAX, of course, that ever was. So it was very important. And then I branched out from there and was drafted by 2 secretary generals. One was Kofi Annan. He put me in charge of the media initiative. His undersecretary, Peter Piot, appointed me as an ambassador for UNAIDS for AIDS. And then Ban Ki-moon came back and also employed me as well. So, it became a real thing. But it didn't happen overnight, Chris. It was more of a gradual transition.
And has the fight been won, or is it, to what extent is it still ongoing?
Well, it's much less than the peak. The peak was probably 98, when over 2 million people a year were dying. Now we have therapeutics, which, by the way, will be the next big hope, I believe, for COVID. But the therapeutics, 6 pills a day, there was a big breakthrough in the mid-90s, went down to 1 pill. We're now into a scenario where you can take an injectable. And it's not a vaccine. It doesn't cure, but it does prevent. So I think we're in much better shape on the AIDS. It's still very tragic. You can't overstate the fact that it still is killing many people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not anywhere near what it was before. So there's been tremendous progress. And what we have done at the MTV side is mainly on the prevention. And some of my other initiatives have also helped on the treatment.
We've talked about Gorbachev, we've talked about Mandela. We know that you're a huge disciple and believer of Churchill and everything Churchill. We know that you actually bought Churchill's flat in Admiralty Arch and a lot of Churchill memorabilia. You're a big expert on Churchill. If those three people have made such a big impact on the world, can you name a fourth? Who would be up there with those three?
Chris Wright?
I don't think so, Bill.
You've done more in the
Right.
music industry than anybody I've ever met. I mean, look at you. You've done so much. And not just music, you branched out, which was amazing.
But in politics or in the United Nations or from another country, or what about China? Because you've had a lot of involvement with China. And what do you think about the current situation with Donald Trump basically blaming China? China's now the bad kid in the room. Is that, how deserved is that? And what's your relationship with the Chinese leaders?
Well, I to this day, I'm on a board of a private equity company, so I still go to China. Once the protocol will be lifted again, I'll be going again. It's based in Shanghai. No, China is it's a big wake up. As you know, advised the State Department the last couple of years, and one of my missions was to develop a plan, a strategy for China, competing with China. I think the situation with China, and because I was going there 30 years ago, I saw the transformation before my eyes, and I have an affection for the Chinese people. I think if you could reduce it to a soundbite almost, it's nationalism, which we don't understand, and antagonism from us, which the Chinese don't understand. And we have to just bridge this gap somehow. But there was a recent meeting in Alaska. I don't know if you've heard about it. It didn't go well. The first day of a 3-day meeting, I think, was yesterday. The antagonism from the US is not understood by the Chinese, and that's the main problem. So we go through a long litany, everything from Hong Kong to the Uyghurs to, God forbid, Taiwan. And the list keeps going, South China Sea, of course. The Western world now, to your point, has suddenly woken up to this as not necessarily a threat, but certainly a very viable competitor. And I think the Western world just needs to accept the fact that China is not going anywhere, obviously, and we have to figure out ways not to necessarily make him as an antagonist, but to work with him in so many ways that we have to work with him. Climate change is a frequently mentioned one, but also there are not good things, as there are good things about any country, and we just have to work with them to persuade them, not to perhaps do some of the things that we don't agree with. I don't think we'll ever get there completely. Democracy in Hong Kong, give Taiwan permanent independence. There are some really big issues coming up with China, and this will be the dominant theme, I believe, geopolitically, certainly with the U.S. And it's interesting how the UK is right alongside the U.S. This is not just one country. And then you add Japan and Korea and some other countries in Southeast Asia. So the world has got to figure this one out.
And you're now working as an advisor to the State Department on issues like this. You were working for the previous administration, and you're still working for the Biden administration on such things as China and the Far East and maybe Russia as well, perhaps.
Yeah, well, Russia's a big one. And by the way, I'm not certain I'm going to be going forward with it because these things tend to change with each administration. As you know, that the U.S. has been so divisive recently that it's either black or white. You can't be in the middle. I'm in the middle, but you can't be in the middle. So I'm not sure it'll continue. But how, Russia is another good point. I mean, when you talk about Russia, it's really Putin. And, last week, Biden had some pretty strong messages for Putin, called him a killer, for example. But, in the situation with Russia, it's not perhaps at the same level as China, because China has so much more competitively, whereas Russia is not competing, but they have the opportunity to make mischief, which they have, of course, and Putin is a dictator, even though he goes by the elections. But, this is a tough relationship as well. Biden, to his credit, completely went 180 to the previous administration and really told it like it is to Putin. So, we'll see. I do think there are opportunities and needs to work with Russia on certain things, not the least of which is Middle East, Afghanistan also. We have a deadline coming up on May 1st for the Taliban. We're going to need to work with Russia on that. The Iranian situation. There has to be ways where we stand up on what we don't believe in to our values, but also try and work with both Russia and China.
And this issue of the Russians influencing US elections, do you believe there's any credibility behind that?
It's been proven. I don't doubt the sources at all. In the highest levels of our government, they have evidence that there has been attempted tampering, not with the voting, but with the opinions on the election. So yes, I think that's, you have to go back in history, I suppose, even though I wouldn't say Russia is necessarily communist, it's authoritarian, and that's in direct contrast with democracy. So it's natural that they will do what they can to upset the democratic principles of the West, not only the US, but also the UK. So yes, the US has to stand up to that, and there will be, I'm sure, some sort of quid pro quo. The most common one nowadays seems to be sanctions, which has limited impact, but we'll see how that plays out.
Quite a life you've had, Bill. Quite a lot of influence you still have on so many things around the world. With your experience of everything, can you solve the COVID pandemic?
Well, there's a little bit of light here. We're still in the tunnel. But we can see a little bit of light. My life I look at as going from, I don't know, in one way, missiles to media and music to now microbes. So I've been working with the leading distributor of vaccines in the world now for 10 years. It's called Gavi, the Global Alliance of Vaccination and Immunization, started by Bill and Melinda Gates 20 years ago. It's a great initiative. But by the way, my third career, I'd like to look at my life as 3 Ds: defense, military, diplomacy, and development, which is now global health. And I've worked on and off with 8 different global health initiatives. AMFARS was a big one, took 2.5 years of my life. But now, most of my time is spent with vaccines. There's good news here. It's not new news. The silver lining in this unbelievable tragedy that was widely predicted, but not widely realized, the economic portion particularly. So it's been devastating to the world, and it's affected all of our lives in ways that we just couldn't have imagined, even though the idea of a pandemic, again, was widely predicted. The silver lining is that the technology behind vaccines can have applications toward all sorts of diseases, including cancer. But just the one narrow aspect of COVID has been a miracle. I like to say vaccines, I know there's lots of opposing thoughts on vaccines, but I like to say vaccines are magic. They truly are technological magic. And this one, or these series of vaccines designed for COVID, has been something that's never been seen. Vaccines in the past have a great history. By the way, coming from the UK, it's a great legacy in the UK. The smallpox vaccine was invented here. Jenner, namesake for the Jenner Institute. Now we have AstraZeneca and Oxford with a COVID vaccine. So vaccines with the new technology that we've never seen before, and all this comes back literally 20 years ago with the mapping of the human genome. And we now have genomics, CRISPR, gene editing, and mRNA. And what is mRNA? mRNA is actually splicing the gene to fool the body into developing antibodies. It's not an inactivated virus, which most vaccines in the past have been. So you have these at least 2 vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, and they're hugely successful. There's a lot of concern and worry. Did it go too fast? Side effects. There has been isolated incidences, but not connected to the vaccine. So putting all that aside, this is really an amazing development. And again, the UK has been the leader, and look what the UK has done. Even though the UK, unfortunately, has the highest, I believe, per capita mortality rate, for many different reasons, it has really rejuvenated itself, reinvented itself with the vaccine. So, this is a great way to end, Chris, I think.
You've had a huge impact on everybody, the world in general, and you've had a hell of a life, Bill. It's just unbelievable what you've achieved. So the world would be a lot poorer place had it not been for Bill Roedy.
Very kind of you to say that, Chris. Right back to you. And I appreciate and respect your friendship so much. So thank you, Chris.
Right on the Nail with Chris Wright.
You've been listening to Right on the Nail with me, Chris Wright. Thank you to my very special guest, Bill Roedy, for an utterly fascinating conversation. And thank you to you too for tuning in. Tweet us at Right on the Nail with any suggestions or feedback. And if you enjoyed the show, please share a link on social media. You can sign up to receive an email whenever a new episode drops at our website, rightonthenail.fm. Remember, there's a new episode every Friday, so catch you next time on Right on the Nail.
Well, wasn't that amazing? It was created and produced by Podcast Partners. They're really lovely people and rather good at all this podcasting guff. Find out more at podcastpartners.com.